Joining us now is decorated Marine veteran and the host of War Stories on Fox, Colonel Oliver North. And Colonel North, thanks so much for being here.
Kathleen, great to be with you again.
Well, President Obama's speech was aimed at redefining U.S. foreign policy in the Mideast and North Africa, but some are saying one of the biggest bombshells from his speech was his call for Israel to withdraw to the 1967 lines.
We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps, so that secure and recognized borders are established for both states. The Palestinian people must have the right to govern themselves and reach their full potential in a sovereign and contiguous state. As for security, every state has the right to self-defense, and Israel must be able to defend itself.
How big of a sellout is this to our longtime ally, Israel?
Well, this is the kind of speech Jimmy Carter could be proud of. I mean, there was nothing new in this speech other than the fact that Mr. Obama said we shouldn't have been surprised at what happened starting back in December in Tunisia. Certainly he was surprised because it took him 14 days to say anything about it. And there's no doubt that things have changed dramatically in that part of the world. What doesn't change in any respect that I could discern from this speech is America's foreign policy. He doesn't bring to bear any new pressure against Iran building nuclear weapons. He announced sanctions that had been imposed days before on Syria, as though that were somehow going to change the Assad regime's approach to its own people. And he basically ignores all the rest of it, just as he has consistently since last December. What he obviously intends to do is to try to build on whatever momentum he has in the Arab world or the Muslim world by attacking America's only ally in that part of the world, the only real democracy in that part of the world, and that's Israel, by pressuring them on the 1967 border issue. It's been around since Jimmy Carter, and obviously he's returned to that same political philosophy.
President Obama said, in effect, that the U.S. realizes it needs to change the way it does business in the region. But did the president spend enough time talking about radical Islam and also the threat of it taking hold in countries like Egypt?
Well, obviously he considers the death of bin Laden to be the game changer out there. He says that now that kind of violence has been rejected by those people in the Middle East that are seeking what he calls self-determination. I think it's anything but clear that the outcome of what's transpired in Egypt or what's going on today in Syria or anything that's happened in Bahrain or Yemen is going to end up with positive change for the people. Ultimately, if you end up with Sharia law, he talked about the fact that 50% of the societies, which are women, actually it's 54% out in that part of the world, need to be part of that society, something we've been advocating for a long time at my end of the world when I go out there and I watch the best ambassadors we've ever had, America's soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines protecting Muslim women. I can't see that he's got anything new in all of this except that frontal assault on what the Israelis regard to be their last bargaining chip. To do this on the eve of Netanyahu's visit to the United States clearly shows this man's ego, and I'm talking about Mr. Obama's, and his willingness to savage, as I call it, the only ally we've got in that part of the world.
How does this compromise U.S. national security?
Well, if you consider the fact that you could end up with something very dramatically different than what his utopian vision is for this part of the world, you could end up with only one country out there that's a favorable ally to the United States. And that country is the target of the potential for an Iranian nuclear weapon. We've now seen the Iranians helping the Syrian government retain control in Damascus. We've now seen an uncertain outcome in Egypt, and he's quite right. It's going to take months, maybe years, for all of it to show up as to where it's going to go. But when you offer nothing more in terms of leverage against the Iranians, who are fomenting much of this, and you offer little support for those who are our allies out in the world, and the only real ally we've got, Israel, being threatened by this push, you've got to concede to the 67 borders, to a contiguous, I mean, one of the key words in there is a contiguous Palestinian state. I don't think anybody rational, to include the Israeli government, has a problem with the idea of a Palestinian state that recognizes Israel's sovereign right to exist. The problem, of course, is getting the Palestinians together that would actually not only recognize it on paper, but do so in fact.
Now, President Obama said that even before bin Laden's death, al-Qaeda was losing its struggle for relevance. The president also said that the U.S. has broken the Taliban's momentum and reaffirmed that this July, the U.S. will begin to bring the troops home from Afghanistan and continue transition to Afghan lead. Did you get the sense that Obama was suggesting the war on terror is coming to an end?
Oh, there's no doubt. And I think we're going to see that as this budget process moves forward. I think you're going to see dramatic cuts in America's defense posture. Certainly the number of American troops deployed overseas, and that includes the fleet assets in the Persian Gulf and the neighborhood. You know, one of the things that people seem to forget is that having bases on both sides of Iran puts them on notice that we can conduct operations against an Iran that's nuclear armed. If you abandon everything out there, pull out of Iraq in its entirety, and cut down to nothing in Afghanistan over the course of the next 3 years, you could end up with Iranian hegemony over that entire part of the world. That's not good for anybody, and it's certainly a threat to those allies that we do have in the Persian Gulf.
Does President Obama's new plan do enough to support democracy in the Islamic Republic? He talked about the need for U.S. support of democracy in the region, but what has he done to support democracy in Iran?
Well, very interesting that the only example he gives of an Arab country that's in the transition to a representative democracy happens to be Iraq. That's what he offers. That happens to be, if anyone remembers correctly, the result of his predecessor's campaign to bring Iraq to the point where it today is a stable representative government, certainly not a Jeffersonian democracy, that is currently, at least, a friend of the United States. I don't see that the things that Mr. Obama is doing is going to lead us to that same kind of conclusion with the rest of his policy for those countries in the region.
Real quickly, we heard a report this week that Iran is reportedly building missile bases in Venezuela. Do you think that this is the beginning of a second U.S. missile crisis?
Not yet, but there's no doubt that the Iranians are going to exploit every opportunity that they have. They're also making deals with the Chinese to get missile hardware, the North Koreans to get nuclear weapons equipment and the like, and the technology and know-how. There's no doubt that we've got adversaries in that region. What we obviously need to be concerned about, again, doesn't help us to say Israel's got to go back to its 67 borders, is protecting our own national interests, and that should include ensuring the stability and safety of the Jewish state.
We touched on Syria earlier. Syria this week was slapped with sanctions, but in this speech, President Obama gave Syrian President Bashar al-Assad a choice: lead the transition or get out. Has the president been tough enough with the regime there, and should he have asked the president to step down?
Well, look, how can you say that the Assad regime is going to somehow transform itself overnight? It's not. And what the Assad regime clearly intends to do is maintain the dynasty that the Alawites have established over it with the help of the Iranians. And they're doing everything they can to repress the people who want some kind of self-determination, and they're not going to get it just because Barack Obama says something.
In Libya, Obama said that Gaddafi has lost confidence and the U.S. and NATO allies will continue military action to pressure Gaddafi to leave and to prevent him from killing his people. Is that enough?
Well, clearly it hasn't been. I mean, you may remember that when Mr. Obama announced our participation in this NATO-led operation, it was all being done as a humanitarian operation and establishing a no-fly zone against a country that doesn't even have an air force. I would point out to you that there's still a lot of people being killed in Libya, and I'd ask Mr. Obama, how's that working out for you?
Colonel North, last question real quickly. Based on everything you heard from the president today during his speech, should Americans feel safer here at home and abroad?
I think we ought to look very carefully at a very naive utopian idea for how the world works. And the idea of stepping back, and as Mr. Obama has done from a leadership position when we are the world superpower, is a deadly mistake for the United States. It offers opportunities for our adversaries and makes our allies very insecure.
All right, Colonel Oliver North, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.